In less than a month of war, the Allied armies were everywhere in retreat. Each day brought new discouragements. For the most part, they were falling back in good order, organizing rearguard operations to cover withdrawals, and performing almost suicidal spoiling attacks when cornered.
The French, also reeling from the attacks initially, were able to get lots of reinforcements brought in their taxicab army from Paris and stop the Germans at the Meuse River. Back and forth a few times, but it ended up that the Germans ended up on one side and they ended up on the other.
With the Germans pressing ever forward and Plan 17 in shreds, the impassive General Joffre exerted his will over the entire front. On August 24th, Joffre made a decision that changed history. Refusing to abandon all thoughts of an offensive, he created a new Sixth Army, commanded by General Minori on the endangered Allied left. He did this by coolly taking troops from his own reserves and the French right just for this purpose. On August 26th, Joffre went to his second meeting with Sir John French. The scene was witnessed by a young liaison officer, Lieutenant Spears.
Joffre began to explain the purport of an order extremely important he'd issued. Whilst he was doing so, in walked Lansac, bustling in. Then Joffre went on explaining this order of his, when Sir John French said, "What about this order? I haven't seen an order." Whereupon General Wilson, the Sub-Chief of Staff, explained rather awkwardly, I thought, that some order had been received during the night, but it hadn't been dealt with yet. I got the impression it had been translated. When General Joffre realized that his orders hadn't even been received and read by the British, he seemed overwhelmed with discouragement. It was the only time I've ever known that he seemed to lose heart himself, to be completely deflated.
This was an abject moment for General Joffre.
When I left British headquarters in the early afternoon, I carried away with me a serious impression of the fragility of our extreme left. And I anxiously asked myself if it could hold out long enough to enable me to regroup our forces. If this maneuver was to succeed, two essential conditions had to be fulfilled. First, our Fourth and Fifth Armies must interrupt their retreat with partial offensives and counterattacks to give me time to assemble a new army on our left. Secondly, the British would have to resist tenaciously and yield ground only very slowly.
That is exactly what Smith-Dorrien's British forces were about to do at Les Cateau. Joffre's calmness and rational approach under pressure was in total contrast to the increasing nervousness of his opponent, Moltke. The German chief of the General Staff was allowing fleeting operational opportunities to obscure the original strategic aim. The dazzling prospect of achieving a double envelopment of the Allied armies had already persuaded him to give the commanders of the left-wing armies their head. On August 23rd, he further dismantled the Schlieffen Plan by releasing 2 corps from the key right wing to help block the Russian advance in East Prussia. Given that, formations had already been detached to deal with various fortresses. The 3 German right-wing armies had by now lost more than a quarter of their strength and had still not fulfilled their principal task. For the Allied and German troops who had to march some 20 miles a day in the searing late August heat, thirst, fatigue, hunger, and blistered feet were of much greater concern than the grand designs of their commanders. After the Battle of Mons, the BEF's 2 corps had become separated by the forest of Montmal. On August 26th, the anniversary of the legendary English victory at the Battle of Crécy, Smith-Dorrien judged that the Germans were so close to Second Corps that they could not disengage without fighting another battle. Contrary to the wishes of Sir John French, he conducted a determined holding action at Les Cateau, where the Germans again suffered severely in the face of the BEF's concentrated rifle fire.
They come up like a football crowd leaving Hampstead Park. They come marching up in droves, firing their rifles from their right hips. They have absolutely no idea of aim.
The cavalry and horse artillery poured it on to the advancing enemy, but the infantry was swarmed by the German lines. Yet the Tommies held on. Once again, the British Enfield rifles had wonderful targets.
There's a letter I read from a machine gunner, German, who wrote his wife. And the British did lead a cavalry charge against an entrenched machine gun position. One of the things that was noticed was he was ordered to open fire. He did. In 15 minutes, there were riderless horses. In 15 minutes, there were men crying for their mothers in the wire. In 15 minutes, there were horses wrapped in the wire, dying and went neighing, last gasp of life, could not get out of the wire, being cut to pieces in their flesh. In 15 minutes, he put his head down on his machine gun, and he said, "I could no longer fire." This was not war. It was murder.
The slaughter took a toll on the assaulting troops and, surprisingly, on the gunners as well.
The other machine gunners in the company stopped because they could no longer do it. The officers yelled at them and urged them to keep firing, because the difference between the enlisted man and the officer knew, if you do not kill your enemy, they will come back to kill you tomorrow. That is the nature of the war.
We'd hardly got our head covered before the ridge, about 3/4 of a mile away, was literally swarming with Germans in their field grey uniforms. And they advanced, and we received the order to rapid fire. It was probably 3/4 of a mile away, an extreme range for a rifle, but we rapid fired at 15 rounds a minute at these advancing Germans, and they broke up into smaller groups of probably 6 or 8, advancing through a cornfield where the corn was in stooks. As we rapid fired, they took cover behind these stooks of corn.
The English infantry stiffened once again. The morning hours passed slowly as more and more Germans entered the fight. The last British reserves were thrown in to meet this new danger.
We were in reserve. The brigade was formed up, and orders came that we were required on the left of the line. We go fast. And we marched 4 miles over the left of the line, came to a village whose name I don't really remember, and found Smith Dorian standing outside his headquarters, and he waved to us as we passed and said, "I think we're holding them all right. It won't be wanted here. And everything's going fine."
The exposed artillery batteries on the right flank lost heavily that morning. Men on the battle line, weary, suffering from the heat, began to drift away from the battle. It was time to go, if it could be managed. The biggest problem was to remove the guns. The limbers and the crews were smashed to pieces on the hillside. Dead horses and dead men were everywhere. The teams that were left dashed forward through jeering infantry.
As they came within view of the enemy, they were struck by a hurricane of shrapnel and bullets from machine guns. But still they went on. The officer in charge of the teams was killed. One team shot down in a heap before the position was reached. But 2 guns of the 122nd Battery were carried out without mishap. A third was limbered up, but the horses went down instantly.
The rest had to be left to the Germans. Incredibly, the 3 divisions of Smith-Dorrien Corps slipped away, and the Germans had no idea where they had gone. It was the British Army's first real battle, and the cost was considerable. 2nd Corps lost 7,182 officers and men and 38 guns. Now they were retreating again. Tired and dirty, but because of their timely stand, they were able to continue their retreat in relatively good order.
We marched and marched day after day. We got very little food. I'd eaten my emergency rations at Cateau, which of course I shouldn't have done. We had a tin of bully beef, I'd eaten that as well, and we were all very, very hungry. We certainly did get a cup of tea occasionally, or a canteen of tea, and we marched through a forest which was very cold and dank. We were marching during the daytime, very big forest. It was very cold in this forest.
On they marched over dust-covered roads through the heat of the day. On they marched 30 miles to the south and the banks of the Somme.
I've seen infantry there with their feet bleeding. I've seen infantry with their boots off and puttees wrapped round them. I've seen men sobbing and turning round asking our officers, why the hell can't we fight? Why won't you let us fight?
It was a hopeless sight. Footsore soldiers and terrified civilians in a single mass of humanity. And that hopelessness began to reach the Allied commander, Joffre.
It was a very, very strange thing to see a single man exercising his will over a mass of about 1 million men with the fate of his country in balance, having to satisfy the political requirements of his own government, the British government, having to face a catastrophic situation and never getting rattled.
Smith-Dorrien's strained relations with Sir John French deteriorated beyond repair after Le Cateau. Yet the standby Second Corps achieved its objective, for it not only led the Germans to overestimate British strength, but also deterred Kluck from immediate pursuit. Moreover, Kluck's mistaken conclusion that the BEF was falling back southwest rather than to the south gave the British formations an unexpected breathing space, permitting them to retreat comparatively unmolested over the next few days. The respite did not dispel Sir John's gloom. Feeling let down by the French and disheartened by the BEF's casualties, he now believed that he could only save the expeditionary force by taking it out of the Allied line of battle and retiring behind the Seine. It took the personal intervention of Kitchener in a hastily arranged visit to France on September 1st to prevent Sir John from following this course. But even with Kitchener's intervention and Joffre's cool demeanor, it still seemed that the only thing that could save the Allies in the West was a miracle.